A woman named Michelle Singleton told courts that she went on food stamps for the first time in her life. She said she had to get humble. She was laid off just after returning from maternity leave. Her consulting rates were cut in half when her industry contracted due to federal grant volatility. A nannying gig bringing in $3,000 per month vanished without notice. She moved back into her childhood home. Then her car was totaled, wiping out her severance and saddling her with a new 6-year auto loan. She is now carrying $50,000 in student loans, a $25,000 car note, and $5,000 in credit card debt. $80,000 in total debt on a combined household income of $175,000 between her and her mother. And she is not the exception. She is the data point that represents millions of Americans who have already crossed the line between struggling and falling, between hanging on and letting go, between making it work and admitting it does not work anymore. On a single night in January 2024, the Department of Housing and Urban Development counted 771,480 people experiencing homelessness in the United States, the highest number ever recorded since HUD began tracking in 2007. That was an 18% increase over the prior year, the largest single-year jump on record. And that number is a floor, not a ceiling, because the point-in-time count is a one-night snapshot that systematically undercounts the true scale of homelessness over the course of a year. Bankruptcy filings rose 14% year-over-year in the first quarter of 2026, according to Epiq AACER data cited by the American Bankruptcy Institute. Total household debt is approaching $18.8 trillion. Credit card balances hit $1.28 trillion in Q4 2025, the highest since the New York Fed began tracking in 1999, and 4.8% of all outstanding debt is in some stage of delinquency. Americans are not approaching the edge. Millions of them have already gone over it, and the country has not noticed because the people who fell are not on television. They are in shelters, in cars, in their parents' basements, in tents, behind strip malls in cities you have visited and never looked twice at. And the numbers are accelerating. And I want you to understand something before we go any further. The people I am going to describe in this video are not people who made catastrophic mistakes. They are not people who gambled their savings on cryptocurrency or quit their jobs to become influencers or refuse to work. They are teachers, nurses, construction workers, administrative assistants, retail managers, truck drivers, social workers. People who did exactly what the system told them to do, got educated, got employed, paid rent on time for years or decades, and still fell, because the floor beneath them was removed one board at a time while the ceiling above them was lowered 1 inch at a time, and eventually there was nowhere left to stand. Rents up 36% since 2020. Groceries up 36% since 2014. Health insurance up 342% since 2000. Childcare exceeding college tuition in 38 states. Auto insurance up 55%, and wages that Brookings documented have produced zero real progress for the median household since 2019. 5 years of working, 5 years of earning, 5 years of inflation, eating every dollar of growth before it reached the checking account. The gap between income and cost of living is not narrowing, it is widening. And the people who fall through it do not fall loudly, they fall quietly. They stop answering the phone, they move in with relatives, they sleep in their car for a few nights that stretch into weeks. They apply for food stamps for the first time and use the phrase Michelle Singleton used. They get humble. And by the time anyone notices they are gone, they are a number in a HUD report that nobody outside of this video will ever read to you in plain English. Nearly 150,000 children were homeless on a single night, and family homelessness surged 39% in 1 year. Family homelessness saw the largest percentage increase of any demographic group in the 2024 HUD count, rising 39% between 2023 and 2024. Not 3.9%, 39% in a single year. Nearly 150,000 children were experiencing homelessness during the snapshot count, a 33% increase over 2023. Those are children sleeping in shelters, in cars, in motels, in abandoned buildings, on the couches of strangers, in tents and parking lots. They are going to school in the morning from a shelter bed. They are doing homework in the back seat of a car parked in a Walmart lot. They are eating breakfast at a soup kitchen and then sitting in a classroom next to a child whose parents just bought a second home. And the Bipartisan Policy Center documented that adults over 65 are now the fastest growing segment of the unhoused population. Seniors, people who worked for 40 years, paid into Social Security, paid into Medicare, did everything the system told them to do, and are now sleeping in shelters because their fixed income cannot cover rent that rose 36% since 2020, and medical costs that consumed whatever savings they had managed to accumulate. The BPC warned of a coming silver tsunami of unhoused seniors as the baby boomer generation ages into a safety net that has been systematically cut, defunded, and restructured to exclude the people it was designed to protect. Homelessness among people experiencing chronic conditions, meaning they have been homeless for at least a year or on 4 separate occasions in 3 years while living with a disabling condition, reached the point where 61% of them were unsheltered, living outside, not in shelters, not in transitional housing, on the street, in tents, under bridges, in the richest country in the history of human civilization, and chronic homelessness in suburban and rural areas, the places that most Americans associate with stability and safety and the American dream, experienced the largest increases. Rural chronic homelessness rose 21.6%. Suburban chronic homelessness rose 12.7%. The crisis has escaped the cities. It is in the counties. It is in the small towns. It is in the communities where the nearest shelter is a 45-minute drive and the nearest food bank closes at 3 p.m. because it does not have the funding to stay open later. Bankruptcy filings jumped 14% in Q1 2026, and household debt crossed $18.80 trillion, with the highest delinquency rate in years. Newsweek reported that total bankruptcy filings rose 14% year-over-year in the first quarter of 2026, according to data from Epiq AACER, cited by the American Bankruptcy Institute. There were 150,009 bankruptcy filings in Q1 2026, up from 132,094 over the same period in 2025. Epiq AACER Vice President Michael Hunter described the acceleration as aligning with broader economic pressures, including household debt nearing $18.8 trillion and delinquency rates worsening to 4.8% across outstanding balances in late 2025, with notable upticks in credit card, mortgage, AACER, and student loan delinquencies amid persistent inflation and elevated interest rates. Credit card balances reached $1.28 trillion in Q4 2025, according to the New York Fed, up 5.5% from a year ago, the highest level since tracking began in 1999. The average American credit card APR is 23.77%, according to LendingTree. At 23.77%, a $10,000 credit card balance that is paid at the minimum generates approximately $15,000 in interest charges before it is paid off. You pay the balance and a half again in interest, on money you already spent, on groceries you already ate, on gas you already burned, on a medical bill from a visit you had 18 months ago. And the lower-income households are being crushed disproportionately. A St. Louis Fed analysis showed that delinquencies in the lowest-income zip codes climbed 53% in relative terms to a rate of 22.8% by Q1 2025, up from 14.9% in Q3 22. Nearly $1 in $4 of debt in the poorest communities is delinquent. But the crisis is not limited to the poor. Even the highest income zip codes saw their delinquency rate jump 73%, from 4.8% to 8.3% over the same period. The delinquency surge is climbing the income ladder. It started in the lowest income communities, and it is now visibly present in the wealthiest ones. Which means this is not a poverty problem, this is a structural failure. The cost of existing in America has exceeded the capacity of the American income structure to fund it, from the bottom of the income distribution to within shouting distance of the top. And behind every bankruptcy filing is a story that looks remarkably similar to Michelle Singleton's. A sequence of ordinary events that applied to a budget with no margin for error cascaded into financial collapse. A medical bill that was supposed to be covered and was not. A job loss followed by a 3-month gap that consumed the emergency fund. A car repair that required a credit card because the savings account was already at zero. A rent increase that turned a manageable budget into a monthly deficit. Bankruptcy is not a moment. It is a process. It takes months of falling behind, months of juggling which bill to pay and which to defer, months of overdraft fees and late charges and interest that compounds on unpaid balances, months of phone calls from collection agencies, months of shame and silence and isolation, before a person finally walks into a bankruptcy attorney's office and admits that the math does not work anymore. And 150,009 Americans walked into that office in the first 3 months of 2026 alone. That is 1,667 filings per day, 69 per hour, more than 1 per minute. Every minute of every hour of every day, another American formally declares that the financial system has broken them. 9 million student loan borrowers defaulted in the largest mass default in American history, and foreclosures are surging. Student loan balances soared to $1.66 trillion in Q4 2025, up $11 billion over the previous quarter according to the New York Fed. And 9.6% of student loan borrowers are seriously delinquent, meaning 90 days or more late. But the real catastrophe is in the default numbers. The Century Foundation reported that nearly 9 million borrowers entered default after the Trump administration restarted the clock on federal student loan repayment in 2025. 9 million defaults, the largest mass student loan default in American history. And the Century Foundation warned that another 17 million borrowers could end up in the same situation following the elimination of the SAVE repayment plan. That is 26 million Americans, roughly 1 in every 5 student loan borrowers, who are either already in default or at imminent risk of default. And default is not a temporary inconvenience. Default destroys credit scores. It triggers wage garnishment. It makes it nearly impossible to rent an apartment because landlords run credit checks. It disqualifies borrowers from future federal student loans, which means their children cannot use Parent Plus loans. It follows you for years after the default itself is resolved, appearing on credit reports and limiting access to mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards at reasonable rates. 9 million Americans are now living with those consequences, and 17 million more may join them. Meanwhile, the housing market is cracking from below. In January 2026, 40,534 U.S. homes were in foreclosure, 32% higher than year-ago levels according to Atom. Foreclosure starts jumped 26% year-over-year, and completed foreclosures surged 59%. The housing data analyst at First American Financial described the most vulnerable group as recent buyers who purchased near-peak prices with minimal down payments and who did not benefit from the earlier pandemic-era home price surge. They entered home ownership with smaller down payments and thinner financial cushions. Foreclosure typically requires 2 triggers in tandem: an income shock and a lack of equity. The income shock is present in the form of layoffs, hours reductions, gig economy instability, and the Iran war-driven cost increases that are eating into household cash flow. The lack of equity is present among buyers who purchased in 2022 and 2023 at the market peak with 3 to 5% down payments and who may now owe more than their home is worth in markets where prices have softened. The 59% surge in completed foreclosures is the sound of the first wave hitting. The second wave, driven by the convergence of energy inflation, tariff reimposition, and Medicaid coverage loss, has not yet begun. And the human dimension of foreclosure is even more devastating than the financial one. Foreclosure does not just take a house. It takes the equity that was supposed to fund a retirement. It takes the stability that children need during their school years. It takes the credit score that determines whether you can rent an apartment after the house is gone, which means the family that loses their home to foreclosure may not be able to qualify for a rental unit and may end up in the very shelters and motels and doubled-up situations that feed the homelessness statistics. The pathway from homeownership to homelessness is shorter than most Americans realize. A missed mortgage payment triggers a default notice at 90 days. A foreclosure filing follows within months. The sale date is typically set within 120 to 180 days after filing. And the family that owned a home 8 months ago is now searching for a rental with a foreclosure on their credit report, a depleted savings account, and potentially thousands of dollars in deficiency judgment debt if the home sold for less than the mortgage balance. The 59% surge in completed foreclosures is not a number. It is 24,000 families in January alone who walked through that process and came out the other side without the home that was supposed to be the foundation of their financial life. And if the recession indicators that are currently flashing across every economic dashboard materialize into an actual contraction in the second half of 2026, the foreclosure numbers will accelerate, because the income shocks and the equity erosion that trigger foreclosures both intensify during recessions. The first wave hit the most vulnerable buyers. The second wave will hit the middle. Eviction filings returned to pre-pandemic levels and renter income after housing hit an all-time low. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies published a finding that should haunt every policymaker in Washington. The median amount of income that a renter household has after paying for housing and utilities has hit an all-time low. Not a recent low, not a cyclical low. An all-time low in the history of the data series. After paying rent, water, electricity, gas, internet, and trash collection, the median renter in America has less money remaining for everything else: food, healthcare, transportation, childcare, clothing, savings, debt payments than at any previous point on record. And eviction filings have returned to pre-pandemic levels. The pandemic-era protections, the eviction moratoriums, the emergency rental assistance, the expanded unemployment benefits, The child tax credit, the direct stimulus payments, collectively reduced poverty by 45% and kept homelessness stable during a period when it would have been expected to surge. Those protections are all gone. Every single one. And the eviction pipeline that they damned has been fully reopened. Landlords are filing at 2019 rates or higher in most major metro areas. And more than half of all eviction filings are against black renters, despite that group representing only 18% of renters, according to Eviction Lab and Census Bureau research. The racial dimension of the eviction crisis is not incidental, it is structural. Decades of redlining, discriminatory lending, wealth gap compounding, and unequal access to legal representation have concentrated black renters in the housing market's most vulnerable positions. In the lowest quality units owned by landlords who file evictions at the highest rates in buildings where maintenance is deferred and code violations are routine. When the eviction moratorium ended, the communities that had been most protected by it were the communities that had been most vulnerable before it, and they are now experiencing the consequences without the buffer. And in 21 states, the number of people living doubled up, meaning crammed into housing with friends or family out of financial necessity, increased between 2022 and 2023, including in Texas, Florida, Illinois, Hawaii, and the District of Columbia. Doubled up living is the step before homelessness. It is the last rung on the ladder before there are no more rungs. And in 21 states, the number of people standing on that last rung is growing. And doubled up living is not the safety net it appears to be from the outside. Multiple people crammed into small spaces, adults sleeping on couches with their children on the floor beside them, hosts who agreed to take someone in for a week and find themselves 3 months later with a household they cannot afford to feed. Lease violations triggered by unauthorized occupants that put both the host and the guest at risk of eviction. Domestic tensions that escalate because financial desperation and spatial compression are a combustible combination. The Alliance to End Homelessness only counts people who are doubling up due to financial necessity, not those who choose to live together, which means every person in the doubled up count is someone who is living in someone else's home because they cannot afford a home of their own. And when the host's patience runs out, or the host's landlord discovers the violation, or the host's own financial situation deteriorates to the point where they can no longer carry the extra mouths, the doubled up person becomes the homeless person. That transition happens thousands of times per day across America. It happens without a headline, without a data release, without anyone counting it until the next January, when the volunteers fan out across the cities at 3 a.m. and count the people sleeping in doorways and cars, and under highway overpasses, and in the tents that have become as permanent as the buildings beside them. Half of America lives paycheck to paycheck, and one crisis separates them from everything you just heard. More than half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, according to the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. One crisis away from homelessness. One medical bill. One layoff. One car breakdown. One rent increase. One divorce. One insurance lapse. That is the distance between the Americans who are reading about homelessness and the Americans who are experiencing it. And the crises that push people over that edge are not exceptional events. They are ordinary life, a medical bill that insurance did not cover. A job that was eliminated in a restructuring. A landlord who sold the building and did not renew the lease. A car that needed a $4,000 repair on a budget that had $200 in savings. These are the actual stories that fill the intake forms at shelters across the country. Not addiction, not mental illness, not laziness, financial shock applied to financial fragility. Researchers at the University of Washington studied homelessness rates across the country and found that high rates of homelessness are caused by shortages of affordable housing, not by mental illness, drug addiction, or poverty alone. The determining variable is the ratio between income and housing cost. In cities where that ratio is most strained, homelessness is highest. In cities where housing is still affordable relative to local wages, homelessness is lower. It is not a moral failure, it is a math problem. And the math has gotten worse every year for 6 consecutive years. Homelessness is now 34% higher than it was a decade ago. The 2024 count of 771,480 is well above the previous peak of approximately 650,000 set in 2007, the year before the last financial crisis. And the people who are homeless have a 60% higher mortality rate than housed individuals living in poverty. Their life expectancy is 26 years shorter than the general population. They experience infectious disease and mental illness at substantially higher rates. They use emergency rooms 3 times as frequently as stably housed people. They are far more often victims of violent attacks. Homelessness does not just remove a roof, it removes years from a life. and 771,480 people are losing those years right now on a single night in America, while the GDP number says the economy is growing and the stock market says everything is fine and the unemployment rate says almost everyone has a job. The numbers that describe the people who fell off the edge are not the numbers that appear on the evening news, because the evening news describes an average and nobody lives in the average. Share this video with every American who still believes the economy is working. Not because the data I cited is an opinion, because the data I cited is published by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the New York Federal Reserve, the American Bankruptcy Institute, Epiq AACER, the St. Louis Federal Reserve, the Century Foundation, ATA Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the University of Michigan, Courts, Newsweek, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every number in this video is verifiable, every trend is documented, every name is sourced, and the picture those numbers paint, taken together, in sequence, in context, is a picture that no single news segment, no single headline, no single press conference has assembled for the American public. 771,480 homeless on a single night, 150,000 children among them. Family homelessness up 39%, seniors the fastest growing homeless group, bankruptcies up 14%, credit card debt at $1.28 trillion, student loan defaults at $9 million, the largest in history, foreclosures up 59%, eviction filings at pre-pandemic levels, renter income after housing at an all-time low, delinquencies climbing the income ladder from the poorest zip codes to the wealthiest, and more than half of all Americans, one crisis away from joining the people who already fell. That is the country you are living in right now. That is the economy that the GDP number describes as growing. That is the labor market that the unemployment rate describes as healthy. And those descriptions are technically accurate and completely meaningless to the 771,480 people who slept outside last night, and the millions more who are one paycheck, one medical bill, one layoff, one rent increase away from joining them. Subscribe. I will see you in the next one. And look around you. Look at the person next to you in the grocery store line who is counting items and putting things back. Look at the car in the parking lot with the blankets in the back seat and the condensation on the inside of the windows at 7 a.m. Look at the apartment building on your block where the eviction notices appear on doors more often than they used to. The people who fell off the edge did not announce it. They did not make a scene. They just disappeared from the life they used to live and entered a life that you drive past every day without seeing. See them, because you might be closer to them than you think. And they were closer to you than they ever imagined.